Thank you, friends. So like I said, the title of this conversation is Bringing Ourselves into Lobbying. But what does that mean? Effective Quaker advocacy is about opening hearts as much as changing minds. We honor that of God inside of all of us when we lobby and when we organize. And we find common ground with others through the humanity that we all share. But this type of advocacy requires grounding in our own spirit and sharing that which makes us vulnerable, our identities, our lived experiences, and our energies. To bring ourselves into our lobbying means opening and exposing our hearts. And in the case of lobbying or organizing others, doing the work to hold the heart of the other person. For some, especially those who have experienced violence within this system that we are working together to change, it can be damaging. And that's why these conversations, like the one we're about to have today, are so important. To advocate together and to lift each other's voices to affect change, we must honor this truth and understand the differences and how much energy it really takes to bring ourselves into our lobbying. Tonight, we're having an intergenerational conversation about what bringing ourselves into lobbying looks like. Our speakers will offer their own experiences, encourage us all to consider how identity affects our lobbying, and discuss the ways that power and privilege show up in and can be challenged through congressional advocacy. Now, joining me for this conversation are Bobby Trice and Mary Lou Hatcher. As FCNL's Quaker Engagement Associate, Bobby Trice cultivates relationships with friends and other FCNL constituents. Bobby is a member of Friends Meeting of Washington, Baltimore Yearly Meeting, and carries a concern for drawing connections between Friends' faith, history, community, and witness in the world. He came to FCNL through our young adult programs and from Swannanoa Valley Friends Meeting, where he realized he had been a Quaker all along. Mary Lou Hatcher is Assistant Clerk of FCNL's General Committee and a member of Lehigh Valley Friends Meeting in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. In her own spiritual life, Mary Lou practices a contemplative silent worship, desiring a clear mind, an open heart, and a humble willingness to respond to God's presence. She has been practicing with Quakers since 1988, serving her local meeting in the areas of religious education, pastoral care, and social concerns. Now, before we begin, I want to remind everyone that in a public forum like this, we are asking our speakers to be vulnerable with a lot of people. And I am sure, as many of you are, all of you are, grateful for Bobby and Mary Lou as they are sharing pieces of their identity with us so that we may be part of an important conversation about Quaker advocacy. I also want to point out that systems of oppression and injustice that we are advocating to change are based in racism and specifically anti-Blackness. I say this to remind all of us that Black, Indigenous, and POC, people of color, advocates experience harm and vulnerability when lobbying that white advocates will not know. So we know that you will not leave this conversation with all the answers for how to perfectly honor all of your fellow advocates' spirits and identities. But we hope that you will leave with a better understanding of what it means to bring ourselves into our lobbying and with a more open heart as well. And with that, I'm so excited to ask y'all some questions. So Mary Lou and Bobby, my first question for y'all is, When you've lobbied, which I know you are both experienced lobbyists, what are ways that you have felt at home or comfortable? And what are ways that you felt the opposite, like you didn't belong in that space? Are there ways that you prepare yourself for a lobby visit that you have found helpful, keeping all those things in mind?
Thanks, Larissa. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm really excited to get into this conversation. First, I just want to acknowledge and give thanks to the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples, the original inhabitants of the land I'm on here in DC, a few miles away from the capital, for their stewardship. To answer the first part of your question, I'm a young adult Quaker from the rural foothills of Northern California. I grew up on an old farmland in a lower middle class household and always sort of felt more at home in the woods or a river canyon than walking through the halls of Congress. Putting on a sort of collared shirt and blazer, slacks and business shoes to lobby, it really at first felt strange and uncomfortable as a kind of assimilation in order to become legible and seem legitimate to Congress. But young adult advocate role models telling their stories and being vulnerable about their feelings of exclusion have been really helpful in making me feel seen and even more at home in this work. For example, just to tell a short story, Katie Breslin, FCNL's former young adult program manager and my first boss at FCNL, told a story at a spring lobby weekend in 2019 that really sticks with me even today. She talked about the first time she walked through the halls of Congress and the sound of her heels clicking on the marble. And at first, how that echo made her feel alone and small, reminding her how sort of cavernous Congress is, both literally and metaphorically. But over time, she grew in confidence, and the sound of her heels clicking on the marble started to empower her, made her feel like she was claiming her space in those halls and announcing herself. That story really gave voice to my own feelings. Not only that, it also really demonstrated to me that there was a community of young adults making their way and carving out space in this political world that so often feels like it's not made for us. And knowing that community existed helped me feel like I could be powerful and a part of something larger, just as I am. I also want to say that older adult role models have been incredibly important in that regard as well. I've encountered many situations throughout my time at FCNL working in various capacities where older adults have actually very intentionally made space for me to raise my voice and to lead them in lobbying activities and in policy discussions. I think we have so much to learn from one another, and that's perhaps where we should focus. Mary Lou, do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's interesting, Bobby, that you mention older adults, because for me, my ability to be comfortable and walk into lobbying, that baton was handed to me from a young adult who came to our meeting and said, we would like you to go lobby your senator. He's a swing vote. He's on the fence and we want his constituents to show up. And I thought, well, that's not something I really do. But it didn't take long for him to convince me and 5 or 6 other folks from my meeting that, in fact, that it wouldn't be that hard, that of course we could do this. So that was my first comfort step, right? From somebody who was in their early 20s who just said, reached out a hand, pulled me in. So that was great. I tend to feel comfortable going into a lobby visit, I think, when I sort of go by the roadmap. I've had some planning ahead of time. I have learned some things about the issue. I feel like I'm not a novice about it. I don't feel like I have to be an expert, but I feel like I like getting some information, my feet on the ground that way. Sometimes when I feel uncomfortable, it's when I feel like I'm being managed by a staffer or a member of Congress. I'm being, flattered. We've probably all heard, oh, you Quakers, you're so organized. We appreciate what you have to say. Or patronized in some way, or just dodged, right? I have to look that up. I don't really know, need to get back to you. And in some ways, it's a little helpful for me when I feel my discomfort rising, because it's a clue that I'm being managed. And then I step up to try to say, what's happening here? Oh, I'm being flattered. Oh, he's dodging the question. Oh, this is happening, that's happening. And then I can sort of settle back into, okay, I can manage, I can do that, I can respond to that. So sometimes the discomfort's actually a little bit helpful.
Yeah, I really resonate with that feeling of discomfort, and the few things that I do this ahead of time to sort of prepare myself is the spiritual, the theoretical, and the practical. The first with the spiritual is that I remind myself that lobbying is as much a spiritual discipline as much as a political activity. I go in reminding myself that there's that of God in me and in the person I'm speaking with. And I put my faith in the spirit to speak through me in the moment if I lose my footing. I also, theoretically, I like to gather as much information as I can about the member of Congress I'm lobbying so that I can sort of tailor my message to meet them where they're at. I also remind myself of a clear sense of purpose. How does my faith lead me to act on this issue? What's the specific importance of the ask? Am I bringing this message to members of Congress? What information am I there to collect? Going in really with clear answers to these questions always helps me feel prepared. And then the practical is, of course, using the roadmap, making sure I'm clear on my role, and I have a clear sense of what I'm going to say while still being open to where the spirit might lead me in that visit.
I am so appreciative of the stories you're both telling, the fact that I kind of laughed right when Mary Lou, you said, well, actually it was a young adult who brought me in. The fact that both of you had another person that recognized a power in you that you maybe hadn't yet, right? And the second part of both of your answers made it clear that now that you have recognized your own power, grounded yourself in your own spirit, and done this lobbying multiple times, you have a lot of very practical advice to give others, and hopefully can then almost pass the baton to the next person, help them recognize their power, bring them in. And that's what I really love about our work is how much of it is recognizing the other person for who they are and helping them get to where we know they can be as advocates. So thank you to whoever it was that brought you both into this work, because obviously we are all benefiting now from that. So another really important piece of our lobbying and our Quaker advocacy is the storytelling that we bring into lobby visits. That's something that I feel is unique in how we display our voice and our power, right? So how do both of you think about what story to tell in a lobby visit?
Well, sometimes for me, it's a personal connection I might have with the person I'm meeting with. One time I met with a state senator, and the group of us that were meeting with her on an environmental issue had no governmental experience with her at all. But I'd had a conversation with her in a pizza parlor when my daughter was had locked herself in the bathroom for a very long time with her friend. And the senator was standing outside of the door trying to get in. And when I shared that memory with the senator, she warmed up right away. And it was amazing to me how quickly we felt at home with each other, sort of on that personal level. But sometimes I think it's important to tell a story that a member of Congress that's outside his or her own experience, that's not a lived experience they've had, and that is important for them to hear and broaden their scope and their knowledge about what are all citizens' lives like. And sometimes it's important to tell a story that it seems to me comes from an unexpected source, an unexpected stereotypical source. So in my experience, that's been things like a white middle-class woman talking about the need to be on food stamps and food support because of her own hunger insecurity, or law enforcement officers talking about the need to end mass incarceration and to get people out of prison, or a military family saying, we need to stop spending all this money on military intervention. We need to decrease military spending and military involvement. And it felt like those stories coming from, in some ways, unexpected places had a certain weight all their own.
Well, Mary Lou, I really love that piece about stories coming from unexpected sources. It really connects to how I approach the same question from my experience in FCNL's Advocacy Corps organizing program. During my year in the Advocacy Corps, we were focusing on the demilitarization of the police and the 1033 program. And might not expect a 18, 19-year-old college student to have that be the #1 priority that they're caring about and lobbying on. But when I was doing that work, I had to come back repeatedly to that question of what story should I tell in these visits about this issue? And part of how I parsed that for myself was sort of, how does my experience and knowledge speak to the issue? And how can I connect my experience with the broader issue addressed by the policy I'm lobbying for? So to give a more specific example, my hometown, California, did get some military equipment through the 1033 program, including a huge armored vehicle called an MRAP, a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle. And when the sheriff's department sort of purchased that, it caused a lot of community foment and distrust of law enforcement and a lot of outrage in my community. So I was able to take that story of what my community was experiencing and then connect it with data of how much 1033 equipment has been transferred to the localities I was advocating in. And then to add another layer, I would support it with research on the detrimental impacts of 1033 equipment in local communities. So I had these sort of layers of my own personal experience, how that affects my local area, and then how nationally the same trend is playing out. But beyond that, there are a few more pieces when I consider what kind of story to tell. One is a sort of discernment around what is actually my story to tell, whose voice and whose story am I centering when I go into these lobby visits? And how can I locate my own experience in relation to marginalized or more impacted communities without co-opting a narrative or telling someone else's story without my permission? Mm-hmm. My answer to those sort of big questions, though maybe a little incomplete, is really to practice integrity and to tell experience, or to tell my own story from my own experience, but also to relate that to the data on how this equipment impacts low-income, Black and Brown and immigrant communities, and show sort of the multidimensionality of the issue, that it's not just because of my experience that I care about this. Sure, my predominantly white communities in the mountains of Northern California and North Carolina are uncomfortable seeing military weaponry in our small towns, but that discomfort pales in comparison to the very real threat this equipment poses to communities of color. A statistic I really love to cite in those lobby visits during that year was, 54% of raids using this equipment impact people of color, according to the ACLU. And I'd really make sure to let staffers know that in a way that didn't compromise my integrity or lead to telling someone else's story without consent and using it for my own purposes. And at the core of it, it's also about balancing my own truth and all of that data and information with meeting the person I'm speaking with where they're at. And how I would do that is, depending on the office I was lobbying and their political bent, I would put more emphasis on issues of oversight and accountability and how a lot of these transfers happen without going through the proper channels and without proper oversight. And I knew that some of these offices would be more responsive to sort of that framing of the argument. I wouldn't lose the other pieces. I would just shift the balance of the emphasis. And it's actually a sort of whole evidence-based methodology for political communication that we're exploring and applying more recently as an organization at FCNL.
When we were first having a conversation about this, just the three of us before everyone else joined, I hadn't actually thought of this, and it's occurring to me now. Both of you are very thoughtfully identifying this process of not only being vulnerable and bringing yourself into lobbying, but knowing that bringing yourself into this type of advocacy and really putting your entire being into it it has to be matched with an understanding of what role you play in a grander picture. Where does your story land in a grander picture of potential, depending on what issue we're talking about, oppression or pain or things like that. And Bobby, I think you really said it perfectly. Just balancing that out is such an important part of what it means to bring yourself and bring others into lobbying, especially those that have stories that might come from a place of deep vulnerability or pain and might not want to share with others, right? So knowing how to balance that out to hold everyone's discomfort in a way that can still produce some effective advocacy and influence, right? So, oh, did I hear someone want to say something else to that? Oh, maybe not. Okay. I must have imagined it. All right, so that really segues us really well into the next question. In what ways do you think your identity affects your lobbying effectiveness and the experience that you have as an advocate?
Well, I'll just sort of go back to the first question where I introduced the different statuses I do hold. I'm lower middle class, come from a rural background. I'm a young adult, a Quaker, a social worker. So all of those things give me a particular perspective on the world and the issues that we advocate for, how rural communities are impacted by policy decisions, the connection between policy and my experience as a young adult and student, learning new things about the world and trying to make my one piece I want to lift up here is the impacts of policy change on my job as a social worker before I came to FCNL. And of course, the impacts of policy changes with the clients and families with whom I worked. Just a really quick story about this. In one of my first lobby visits during the Advocacy Corps, I met with Senator Tillis's staff in DC with a fellow North Carolina Advocacy Corps organizer. We researched him together. As a social work student, I had been engaged in service learning with local veterans organizations and had seen how some of their policy work with the VA was resulting in like super life-changing impacts for the clients I was working with at the time. So I was able to thank that staffer for his work on Veterans Affairs issues. And my colleague's grandfather was actually a North Carolina veteran. And so she also thanked him on a very personal level. And since we had those identities and those experiences, we were able to connect with him on this heart level where we recognized how much work he put in and day out to support veterans in his office. And it's something that he clearly hadn't been recognized for, really. After we said that, he sort of melted. He opened up and smiled and started asking a lot of follow-up questions about our ask to support this bill to limit the militarization of the police. He said he would reach out to the original sponsor of the bill's office and see, where he could find areas of collaboration between that office and his own. And so for me, anyways, it really demonstrated the power of like using this combination of knowledge, experience, and my part of my identity as a social work student and my colleague's identity as a family member of a veteran to connect with a staffer on that personal human level, helped us build a relationship and ultimately helped us make progress on advocating for that bill.
Well, I'm very aware more and more every day of my identity as a white middle-class person and also a person who's been very well schooled in a formal way. I used to say I'm well educated, but I think now I think to myself, all people are educated. I'm well schooled. And so it's just a different way of looking at it and realizing education comes in all kinds of forms. But those identities of being, I think, white and middle class and well schooled and having a handle on language are all door openers. I know that. And I have access through those doors. And I really don't question them. When I walk into the congressional things, I'm not thinking about my heels clicking on the floor. I'm thinking I have a complete and total right to be there. And I realize that's not the case for everyone. And when I think about privilege, that's the kind of privilege I want for everyone. I want everyone to feel they have a perfect and complete right to be there. But I'm also female. And over the course of my life, I've been patted on my behind. I've been patted on my head. I've been patted on my hand in a kind of there, let me tell you how this really works sort of way, from being quite young to being substantially middle-aged. Right? So I always know and assume that there's that kind of feeling out there about women and their power and their perspective. And I'm always wanting to be a little alert to comments and subtleties that feel somewhat dismissive. And I want to invite myself to kind of lean in when that happens and say more about that, please. Or I'm not sure you're hearing me correctly. I was delighted when our current House of Representatives, our current representative who's female has been in her job for about a year and a half, on the House floor said to another member of Congress, "Sir, excuse me, I'm an attorney. You do not need to explain to me how the law works. Let's proceed with the question at hand." And that kind of interruption of it's a lot what women deal with on a regular basis, I think. Also aware, and this is an interesting thing, that as I get older, and I'm an older female, in many ways, issues like beauty and what I'm wearing are not up and front and center for other people. And there is a kind of enormous freedom in that, you know, to not really have to think about it. So those are some of my identities and how I carry them around.
Thank you both for sharing, again, pieces of your identity with us, giving me a lot to think about, but I will go ahead and ask the next question. So in what ways have you experienced lobbying as a way to challenge assumptions about who has power and authority in decision-making? We're talking a lot about privilege and power. And I want to know, how has the experience of lobbying challenged some of what you have maybe been socialized to think about power and authority?
Well, I'll take that on first, Bobby. There's an internal and an external component to this to me. And the internal component is, how do I carry the advocacy work that I do? Often when I go into lobby, I am not the person principally affected by the bill I'm there to represent. I am not directly affected by the war in Yemen. I am free. I am not so affected by police brutality. I'm a person who has adequate healthcare and adequate housing. So I know in many ways, coming from my background, I'm not on the front lines of these issues. But I read a quote recently that helps me really hold, how do I understand being there as a person who cares myself and who cares for other human beings' situations. And the quote is, "Never seek to be a voice for the voiceless. There is no such thing. Even the silent have a voice." And I just like carrying that in me, that sense. I mean, it sort of keeps me humble. It's like, don't think you're here to save anybody. You're just here to offer your part of this. Lots of people are working on making it a more just world. And everyone's voice is adding such significant weight to that conversation. So I think that's the internal part, to just kind of remember my place in the whole thing. Just a very subtle external thing is the ways that groups are named, and the ways we describe. So much these days, we don't usually say minority groups, we say underrepresented groups. We don't say illegal aliens, we say undocumented persons. Right? It's a much more clear way of describing what is going on and who people are in their full humanity. And I have to say that I am really helped working in collaboration with other people, because some of those old patterns, pronouns, they're so ingrained in me and they're so old that even when I've made a decision to change, I'm slipping. And I have been really grateful when I've made mistakes around others in governance and in the staff and advocacy situations, when somebody just kind of gently says, maybe we mean this, and rephrases what I've said. It's so helpful to me. But those are more ways I'm personally working with some of this challenging assumptions, just trying to get my own feet on the ground.
Thanks, Mary Lou. Bobby, before you give some of your thoughts, Mary Lou, actually there's someone in the chat asking if you could repeat that quote and just let us know again where you heard it or where you read it.
I don't know the source. I got it off of somebody else quoting, but the quote is, "Never seek to be a voice for the voiceless, for there is no such thing. Even the silent have voice."
Thank you.
I'm glad we took a minute to come back to that quote, Mary Lou, because it resonates deeply with me as well. For a very long time, as a young person holding various identities, I felt very disempowered and silenced in different ways. And I think largely actually through FCNL's young adult programs, which I've done many of them, I learned a sense of empowerment to own my voice and my experience and my expertise, rather than discount certain aspects of who I am and what I bring because I might not be old enough or rich enough or schooled enough or city slick enough. I started really seeing those parts of myself as indispensable assets rather than as flaws or barriers. I think part of that too was the way that FCNL supported me in doing intergenerational lobbying work and collaborating across certain lines of difference. I mentioned earlier how older adults have often, in my experience, sort of continuously made room for me to lead. Other times I've had to push a little bit to make that space for myself. Definitely have some work to do sometimes with being aware of intergenerational, age difference dynamics and how authority does sometimes default to folks in the room who feel like they've lobbied before, their experience, so they know how the show should be run. But more often than not, I've actually experienced an invitation to take up some space and to grow into a leadership role. Another way this sort of happened for me was during a lobby training that I gave years ago during the advocacy corps for college students on my campus. A freshman mistakenly thought I was a professor because I was up in front of the room, I was giving a PowerPoint, I was talking about what lobbying is and how to do civic engagement. And that assumption was sort of interesting to me because she associated that level of expertise or engagement with someone who was older, who was more educated, who was more professional. And I, in that moment, was able to challenge that assumption by revealing I was a student just like her and to be a little vulnerable about it. And I think reflecting back, I was able to move from just being inspired by other young adult role models and leaders to also being able to sometimes do that for others, like Katie Breslin's heel clicking story I shared.
So I'm thinking about this quote, Mary Lou, and I think it's great when you say silent, and someone actually kind of mentioned this in the chat, so I will get to a question from the chat in a moment. I think of it more so as silenced, right? So everyone has a voice, but many are not listened to or heard. You can be screaming out that you need something, that your community is in need of something, and you are not heard. And myself, as a woman of color, have experienced this in my lobbying. So for me, it's about creating space, like you said, Bobby, and also I'm a very visual person. I'm just imagining each of us with a megaphone. We hold the megaphone up to the people who are not being heard, right? So we are not speaking for them, but rather amplifying what they are already saying and what they've been saying, they're just not being heard, right? And to that end, we do have a question in the chat. Again, for all of you who are listening, tuning in, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and we will try our best to get to them. But the question is, how do voiceless people, completely silenced people, have a voice? What does that really mean? And kind of as a follow-up to that, if you are not there to save, I think Mary Lou, you might have said something like that. That's not what you're doing. If you're not there to do that, then what are you there to do? What is the framing that you would present for what you think your role is in that moment? And this is for Bobby as well, although it was a direct question to something Mary Lou said, but please, this is a conversation. So whichever one of you wants to share your thoughts.
Well, you know, the first word that comes to mind is ally. I'm there to be an ally. And I'm also there to say that my world is damaged by so many people being silenced. That doesn't give me a rich life and world. So it's not like people being silenced doesn't affect me. It's not as direct or traumatic, but it is a real robbing of the richness that we want in life. So kind of an ally that we all deserve to have, a rich and full culture, a safe and productive culture where we all thrive. And when we all thrive, we all thrive. So I don't know if that specifically gets to, I would say that I thought one of the most effective lobby visits that I was ever part of was a local, it was in our local community, but it was with our member of Congress, our House representative. And we were lobbying on mass incarceration. And we had worked really hard to recruit a group of people who could give full voice, perhaps, to the issue. So we had formerly incarcerated persons with us. We had persons who visited people in prisons, both students from the local university and folks who went in from churches as chaplains. We had staff from the prison who worked on the recidivism program and a person who was the warden of the prison. And we had people who just said, from my faith-based experience, this is wrong. And it was an irrefutable argument because it came from every imaginable perspective and every imaginable voice. That's good to remember that. That was a good moment.
Love that story, Mary Lou. And I do want to lift up something that was said in the chat because I think it ties in really well with your take on how people being silenced takes away from all of our experiences. You know, someone said, shared a Native American saying, if I am coming to help, I am wasting my time. If I'm coming because of my liberation is tied up with yours, I may be welcome. Mm-hmm. And I love that relational approach to understanding sort of acting in solidarity, which is how I think of when I go into lobby visits often. Another way I think of it, though, is living faithfully. I'm speaking the truth that power needs to hear sometimes to bring about the changes that I truly believe are necessary to mend this broken world. Mm. Stop there.
I really like what you said, Mary Lou, about, you know, we all thrive. When we all thrive, we all thrive. And I'm thinking about, I forget now exactly who it was. I think it might have been Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm sure it wasn't just him. I think this has been said in various different forms, but this idea that, or maybe, I think I might have gotten that wrong, but I've heard it from different sources. This idea that we are not free, you know, those who are oppressed, those who are marginalized are not free. Those who have power, those who have privilege are not free until we are all free. And that really was just ringing through my head while you were talking, Mary Lou. I mean, we are working to advocate for changes to a system that hurts all of us in many ways, even if we don't see it, even if it's not a direct impact on us. In various ways, we all hold power and privilege, different ways as well. The three of us are very different people, but we all hold power and privilege in various aspects of our lives. And knowing that working to change a system that really oppresses everyone, although rooted in anti-Blackness and oppression of specifically, you know, marginalized racial groups, I think that's really important to hold. I have another question from the chat. So, two aspects of identity that haven't been mentioned explicitly are ability versus disability, or differently abled, and ageism. So I think we might have talked a little bit about differences in age and how that has affected our lobbying, but how have these parts of your identity, how have they played out in your lobbying? For example, have you seen older or people with disabilities treated differently by officials and staffers in congressional offices? Same with if you are young, have you been treated differently because of that? Have you called them out in any way, or have you done something internal to try and navigate that instead? How either of you can jump in and start.
We lobbied, the Pennsylvania delegation lobbied one year with somebody who was significantly wheelchair bound, and it was an eye-opening experience to see just the time and the care it took to figure out how that was all going to happen. It was good for me to realize I take my abled body for granted. I take the ease with which I can move through the world and in ways other people can't, for granted. But it is rich when we do whatever we need to do to make sure everyone who wants to participate is participating fully.
Bobby, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think Mary Lou said it really beautifully, actually. Leave it at that.
Great. All right, well, I think we have time for one more question from the chat. And thank you all for being patient with me as there are lots of questions. I'm trying to make sure I'm picking them out and asking our panelists. So someone here is asking, how can we know if we are truly speaking in solidarity with marginalized folks, or that we are truly, as I was saying earlier, amplifying their voices? How do you ensure or know that that's really what you're doing versus, you know, what you think certain communities or other people that cannot be in that lobby visit with you actually, you know, how do you know that that's actually what they want and not what you think that they want. So how can you ensure that you really are being that ally that you talked about being, Mary Lou? What are some ways that you all have navigated that?
Do you want to go
I can
first, Bobby?
jump
Because
in.
I've been doing that a lot.
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. I think a big part of it is paying attention to what organizations led by people of color or whichever marginalized group, where I'm seeking to be in solidarity with what they are doing and what they are saying, and investing in relationships with my friends who hold various identities, and learning and listening from them and their experiences, and having very frank conversations about the needs in their communities. And I do think someone said this earlier in the chat, that bringing people with you, if it's possible, can be a form of accompaniment that can also serve solidarity work. Um, Again, though, like Larissa said earlier, not everyone is willing or able to do that and to go into a lobby visit. So sometimes I think of it also as when I truly am in right relationship with folks and trying to act in solidarity, that I am able to sort of leverage my own privilege and pull on the levers of power to accomplish a particular task or deliver a certain message. But it all has to be sort of grounded in that accountability and following the lead of folks who are directly impacted.
I would say trying to listen to the diversity that exists within groups that are different than mine. In my community, we have a strong NAACP chapter. We have a strong Black Lives Matter chapter, and they don't necessarily agree with each other all the time. And I find it helpful to listen to a broad spectrum of concerns and issues and perspectives from folks from different groups. I also try to read outside of the mainline press, blogs and articles and essays by folks from lots of different backgrounds, just to try to broaden what I'm seeing so that I can see things more clearly. I have a friend who he's Latinx, and he works closely with the police. And before I was doing some lobbying on policing, I just asked if I could have, a 45-minute conversation, because it's not usually ever shorter than 45 minutes when I'm talking to this person. And he just kind of shared a lot of what he was seeing. And so I have a lot of learning to do. And that's both exciting and also a little embarrassing sometimes, right? To know how limited your own perspective has historically been and is historically now. But I also find there are lots of ways to find teachers in print if you don't have teachers in person that is helpful. And then I don't think that assures that I'm always saying the right thing or doing the right thing. But I guess I have this assumption that I want to show up and try to do something rather than get it perfect before I show up. Somebody along the way will correct me when I need to be corrected.
Yeah, and I want to lift up what Bobby was saying about organizations that are led by directly impacted communities. I'm currently working on immigration with the Advocacy Corps, and we have been in very close contact and also following the lead of United We Dream, which is the largest immigrant-led grassroots organization. And it's just critical that we listen to directly impacted communities in any issue that we're working on. So to the person who asked that question in the chat, thank you for reminding us that we cannot speak for others in any moment. And even while we're trying to amplify others' voices, we need to do that in authentic collaboration. And with that, I want to ask Bobby and Mary Lou just one final question before we close out. So what final thoughts do you all want to share about how we can approach holding each other while we are lobbying together?
Mm. the FCNL governance has recently tried to outline a community agreement of stances and behaviors that we will work on together as ways of being more approaching being a beloved community. And there are things like bravery and truthfulness. And one of them that stands out for me is curiosity. That I ask myself always to try to stay curious, ask more questions, make less deductions, conclusions, ask more questions, lean in with questions. So I guess a part of holding each other for me is just staying curious about who other people are and open to their experience being different than mine, and me being able to share things genuinely from my own experience, but learn a lot from others as well. That's a spiritual stance to me because it feels expansive, it feels open, it feels changing, it feels full of breath, life. So staying curious.
I love sort of the humility that undergirds that idea of staying curious, Mary Lou, being open to learning from one another, being ready to make mistakes and to be corrected, but investing in an ongoing dialogue and work together. This question sort of speaks to an experience I had about collaborating on lobbying across political difference specifically. I think it was my first Spring Lobby weekend in 2018. I led a group of students from my college in North Carolina. And when we got to DC and we're at Spring Lobby weekend, we combined into a massive delegation with a group of students from sort of a rival school in the area. And we had to navigate some tensions between our groups. The other group was more bipartisan than ours was. There were some more conservative students in that group who had different talking points and values and reasons that they cared about immigration reform and showed up to lobby that day. It really made my whole delegation have some hard conversations about the value of sort of coalitional perspectives and lobby visits. Like, yes, conservative and liberal students were coming together to advocate for immigration reform. And yes, that can be more powerful than arguing for sort of a purity of perspective and everyone having the same exact talking points and values and stories. We can still lobby together and find common ground, even if we don't all come for the same reasons. And so in sum, I would say to hold each other, we can work to make space for all voices while recognizing everyone brings a different level of experience lobbying, direct impact with the issue, and different perspectives, skills, and gifts. Like taking a beat to recognize that and the differences as strengths in the group is really important. It takes time, it takes curiosity and humility and investment in relationship with one another. And that can be really messy, but it's always worth it.
What a wonderful way to close out our conversation. Thank you, Mary Lou. Thank you, Bobby. I really hope that everyone listening has been challenged to think about how they are bringing themselves into their lobbying and bringing others into their lobbying as well. Before we close out, I'm going to hand things over to Annie for a couple final announcements. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Larissa.
Well, that was a really wonderful discussion, and I'm so grateful for all three of you and to everyone who joined us here this evening or afternoon or whatever time it might be where you are. Before we wrap up this discussion, if you'd like to see some more examples of how people bring themselves into lobbying, I encourage you to take a look at the Telling Your Story videos from our recently concluded Spring Lobby Weekend. 2 weeks ago, just a little less than 2 weeks ago, hundreds of young adults asked Congress for urgent action to end the crisis of systemic racism and militarization in policing. At fcnl.org/SLW, which I will put in the chat in just a moment, you'll find videos of the programming and the speakers from the event. including 3 people telling their stories about why they lobbied to stop police violence. Also, I do want to point out that next month we have another Quaker Changemaker event on April 28th, focused on how Quakers are working on climate justice. And I'll put that registration link in the chat in a moment as well. FCNL's Clarence Edwards will host a conversation about Friends' experiences, goals, and concerns in pursuing an Earth restored. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been a really wonderful and robust conversation, both in the chat and with our panelists. So thank you all so much. And with that, I think we'll just close out with a little bit of a screen share, and I hope that you all have a wonderful evening.